Hey everyone, I'm Terry Moran. We're coming on the air because we have breaking news right now. A jury in Manhattan has found the Trump Organization guilty of tax fraud and several charges. This is a case that was brought in New York City. It is a criminal case against the Trump Organization, the company that former President Donald Trump owned. His father founded it, and prosecutors had investigated it and alleged that there was essentially funds from the business that were distributed without tax consequences to executives, not including, in this instance, Donald Trump himself, but things like Mercedes-Benz and cash at Christmas time and fancy apartments were provided to others without the knowledge of the IRS and without the tax consequences that such transfers should require under law. And so this is a guilty verdict by a jury in Manhattan against the Trump Organization. A lot of people have been watching this. For more, let's bring in ABC News contributor and former FBI agent Brad Garrett. So, Brad, this is a criminal case against the company, and the jury has found beyond a reasonable doubt that they engaged in criminal conduct in essentially providing perks to executives without properly accounting for them under the tax laws. How serious is this, and what does this tell you about the prosecution?
Okay, so it's very serious because it really talks about a systematic scheme to defraud or misrepresent what you should legitimately be taxed for. And it goes to your point, Terry, individuals that worked for the Trump Organization, to under-evaluating buildings. I mean, the government really had to show sort of a systematic scheme by the Trump Organization of all sorts of basically tax evasion or tax fraud, maybe both. And we're able to convince a jury that that really was the case. Now, if the question is anybody going to go to jail, I don't know about that because it's the corporation that was charged, but it could just be a massive amount of money, and it will create, I think, all sorts of problems for the Trump Organization as far as credit, getting credit, in anything that has to do with finances that they may need to continue to promote the organization.
And that essentially, thank you, Brad, was at the heart of the trial. The jurors had to decide that this was done to benefit the organization. The company is the defendant. The company's defense was, it was our accountant, our chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, who was a longtime associate of Donald Trump and who, you may recall, had cooperated with prosecutors after personally being investigated. And the defense was the organization was not aware of any benefits it might have accrued from Weisselberg's conduct. The jury rejected that and said that this was done to benefit the Trump Organization. There you see Letitia James, the New York State Attorney General. Brad, I want to ask about this. So she is the one who initiated this investigation and this prosecution, the Attorney General of the sovereign state of New York, and she said she ran for re-election on "I will get Trump." I don't know, there's something the civil libertarian in me that thinks that's not the way things should go.
Well, no, Terry, but, politicians, we both hear this every day, say grandiose, self-serving things. And does that fit that category? Probably. But, they can say anything they want. You're talking about in front of seasoned judges using seasoned prosecutors to present a case. I mean, tax fraud, think about it. It's documents, it's emails, it's text messages, it's direct conversations that may have been recorded. I mean, it gets very specific. And so I think that there was overwhelming evidence of tax fraud in, as I mentioned earlier, a number of avenues. And so as a result, I think the jury really didn't have that big a problem in figuring out it's clear that tax fraud occurred in this case.
That's a great point and a great distinction there, Brad. Thank you. Between whatever politicians say and the way things work in court, where you got to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and prosecutors did in this case. Let's bring in our investigative reporter, Catherine Falders, who has been on all of the lines of inquiry into Trump and the Trump Organization. I guess we just lost. So Brad, I'll come back to you on that question of proving beyond a reasonable doubt. You talk about the prosecutors. Now, they had a cooperating witness. They had the accountant, the chief financial officer for the corporation, Alan Weisselberg, who did cooperate. He did not cooperate in an investigation of Donald Trump personally, but against the organization. And the defense was, well, he's just trying to help himself get out of the trouble that he landed in. Many of these benefits were for Weisselberg. His kids were put into private school. He had a Mercedes-Benz, all provided at the expense of the company without telling the IRS. But the jury didn't buy it. They said, well, whatever his motives might be, the evidence is there. And that, once again, as you were suggesting, this was a well-run prosecution, it seems.
Well, I think there's little doubt of that. And the other aspect of this is that to blame Weisselberg and, you know, it's just him sort of manipulating is just ridiculous, because you would have to show that the Trump organization systematically was involved in tax fraud. In other words, clearly Weisselberg has admitted some of the things, if not all of the things he was involved in. But did he have input from higher ups in the Trump organization? Of course he did. So they would show a pattern of evidence and information of all of these other people that have fed in to this tax fraud conspiracy. So my guess is, I mean, that's really no defense based on what I think the government had to show this was a systematic tax fraud case.
And it failed with the jury, as I say. But the Trump organization is out with a statement after these guilty verdicts on conspiracy and tax fraud against the Trump organization. And the organization's statement deals with Mr. Alan Weisselberg, who was the former chief financial officer and has now essentially cooperated with prosecutors. Here's the Trump organization's statement as follows, quote, Mr. Weisselberg testified under oath that he, quote, betrayed the trust the company had placed in him and that he at all times acted, quote, solely for his, quote, own personal gain and out of his, quote, own personal greed. That would have been what Weisselberg acknowledged in his guilty plea. The Trump organization statement continues, the notion that a company could be held responsible for an employee's actions to benefit themselves on their own personal tax returns is simply preposterous. Now, Brad, if I could just come back to you once more, they're now, that's a case on appeal, isn't it? You see the Trump organization guilty counts there.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. But that's a great statement for the people who don't really know or understand this case, which is going to be, quite frankly, a majority of folks who have heard about this case. So that's kind of a self-serving, you know, it's him, it's not us. But to go back to what I said earlier, Terry, there is mountains of evidence that shows the coordinated, systematic tax fraud that goes beyond just what happened with Weisselberg. And now look, in every case, the criminal cases, the violent criminal cases you and I have talked about, there are many times our informants. Are informants self-serving? Sure they are, but you still have to prove the case.
Right. And sometimes they may be self-serving, but they're telling the truth. And the jury here certainly believed the prosecution and its witnesses. Let's bring in our investigative executive editorial producer, John Santucci. John, you know this organization and the Trump himself so well. You've reported on him for years for us. So let me ask you about this verdict. What's your reaction? What does it tell you, first, about the Trump organization and about Donald Trump himself and whatever jeopardy or risk he may face now?
Well, the big thing has always been, Terry, that the risk was going to be that if they were found guilty of a felony, and they've been found guilty now of multiple felonies, the banks could come calling. And this could be the biggest problem that would happen for the Trump organization. Because as we've reported over the years, many of Donald Trump's businesses have been on the books with many banks, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America. So if any of us, you, me, apply for a mortgage, mortgage, we get our mortgage. If we are convicted of a felony, Terry, the bank could come calling and say, hi there, we don't want to do business with you anymore. And that has been the fear for many executives and many family members of Donald Trump, that if they were found guilty, this could happen. Look, if you've talked to people that have been around Donald Trump for the last several weeks, as this trial has gone on for some time, it was delayed due to COVID at one point early on. Many people will tell you that Donald Trump was going around Mar-a-Lago saying, well, it's a New York jury, they're going to convict me, it's going to happen, they're going to find me guilty. And ultimately, that's what's happened here. There were conversations, we know, Terry, early on between attorneys for the Trump Organization and prosecutors in the Manhattan DA's office as lawyers tried to come to a deal, said, listen, we'll plead to something. We just don't want to touch a felony, because if we plead guilty to a felony, it's the same thing as is happening right now, as we're seeing. Ultimately, they'd have a problem with their lenders. So now is going to be the question of how this moves forward. We've reached out to members of the Trump family, to the former president, to see if they will appeal. You got to imagine that that is certainly going to happen, but that statement we obtained, which you just shared with our viewers, it is very clear they are trying to blame Alan Weisselberg. And as Terry, you'll recall, this was a person that had been very loyal to Donald Trump. He worked for Donald Trump's father before he ended up working for the Trump Organization. Donald Trump was stunned when we actually told him that Weisselberg was led into court in cuffs this time last summer when this trial first began. But that statement, I mean, it's stunning. Yet again, Donald Trump uses the age-old adage, that person did their own thing, I knew nothing about it, even though Weisselberg is someone that Donald Trump has written glowingly about over the years, how close he was to Trump and the family.
Yeah, well, to use a New York phrase, he's dead to him now, right? After. But let me ask you about the scale of what we're talking about. So Weisselberg acknowledged about $2 million worth of ill-gotten gains in what is essentially a moving of money or personal benefits that he got, an apartment, his kid's private school, a Mercedes-Benz, from the company without acknowledging it to the IRS. Prosecutor says that, in effect, is the company paying him more and not putting it on the books, and that is a benefit to the company. That's why the company's been convicted. But I just want to, that figure, $2 million, it jumps out at me. That's not a lot of money in a company this size, is it? And I'm just wondering about the extent of the criminality that the jury has found here.
It's not a lot, Terry, but we have to remember this is not the only case into Donald Trump's finances that is currently going on. There is a long-time civil investigation led by the New York Attorney General. You mentioned we saw her walking out of court there. This was not her case, to be very clear. There was a joint agreement of prosecutors working together, prosecutors from the Manhattan DA's office, which brought this case, and the New York Attorney General's office, that is the case that I'm referring to. They worked together because they were going down similar paths, if you will. The Manhattan DA case focused strictly on these fringe benefits that you mentioned, the cars, the apartments, the school tuition, etc. But the New York Attorney General's probe has looked more into Donald Trump's evaluation and devaluation of properties. And we've seen the charges she has brought. Now, they are civil charges, but they come with a hefty fine. That's way more than $2 million. We're in the hundreds of millions of dollars in that case. But I think what both of these cases show is, frankly, just the way that the Trump Organization has done business for multiple years, the way that they tried to touch that red line and ultimately, as this case proves, cross it.
John, I thank you for correcting me. I got my Trump investigations kind of tangled up there. You can keep them all.
There's too many, Terry. We have an Excel sheet.
I know you keep them straight. Trump himself. Yeah. Look, it's got his name on it, right? This is the organization founded by his dad, and it's something that is linked to his identity, his public image, and probably, a sense of himself. How much of a blow is it to him, do you think? The fines aren't big, but it stands convicted in a court of of a crime against the United States.
Well, and it's also a charge from a city that built Donald Trump, right? I mean, you think about when he made his first campaign announcement in 2015, it was down the golden escalator in Trump Tower. When he made his first campaign trip out to Iowa, it was on what ultimately got the nickname Trump Force One, and it was the Trump Organization plane with the letters TRUMP emblazoned on the body of the jet. You know, that's a guy that has always bragged, right? I mean, it's someone who has said quite famously that he wouldn't lose a supporter because he could walk outside of his Fifth Avenue office, which is where the Trump Organization lives, and shoot someone, and he wouldn't lose a supporter. Donald Trump and New York are synonymous. I think a lot of us right now, I know in my household, Terry, we've probably watched Home Alone 2 800 times by now, thanks to my son, and you see Donald Trump walking through the Plaza Hotel, correcting Kevin McAllister, right? New York and Donald Trump are synonymous. That's how so many people around this country have associated him. And to think that New York on multiple fronts has broken up with Trump, and we've seen it. Trump has broken up with New York. He had changed his residency to Florida. All of his children now live in Florida. And it is quite possible after this, the Trump Organization might follow suit. It's something that has been discussed, nothing official yet, but I do think that is the next shoe to drop, if you will, as Donald Trump and New York continue their divorce.
Huge consequences for the former president. It's got to hurt. It really does. John, thanks. Stand by. Let's bring in ABC News senior investigative reporter Aaron Katursky. Aaron, you've covered this trial. You're there in the moment. Tell us what's going on, what it feels like, and what you think the importance and significance of these verdicts are.
Terry, the importance of the verdict, I think it cannot be overstated for the Trump Organization. It is now labeled a felon. And many other companies that it does business with may have internal policies preventing them from doing business with felons. It's possible loans get called in or contracts get canceled with the Trump Organization going forward. But this verdict came after about 10 hours of deliberations on the second day that the jury had the case. And they were guilty on all counts. The jury verdict, 4 women stood up, affirmed the verdict. Each member was questioned. Terry, the Trump Organization evaded taxes because some of its top executives schemed for years to get paid under the table with perks instead of proper salary. Things like tuition for the grandkids to go to fancy private school here in Manhattan, rent for a nice apartment along the Hudson River, or even extra cash at Christmas time. Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer, would write down his salary, falsify his W-2, and not declare those perks as income. And the defense tried to say that, no, Weisselberg was just greedy, that the company had no benefit. But prosecutors said that there was an intent to benefit because the Trump Organization could pay less in salary and bonuses and pay a little bit less on its payroll taxes, too.
So a huge verdict for the Trump Organization. And Aaron, I just want to follow up. So this is the company founded by Donald Trump's father, the Trump Organization, that has now been found guilty of crimes, tax crimes, and conspiracy. But Donald Trump himself, personally, not a defendant in this trial, supposed to keep him very separate, but he was mentioned plenty in this trial. It was the elephant not in the room, as one of the lawyers said. What did we learn about Trump and whatever possible criminal liability, if any, he might face because of these shenanigans that a jury has now found the Trump Organization was involved in?
The Manhattan District Attorney's Office has an ongoing criminal investigation that could well target Trump in the future. That investigation had seemed dormant earlier this year, but has been revived in more recent months to go far as back as the hush payment to Stormy Daniels. Prosecutors have been looking at that again. And then there's all the ways that Trump would value his real estate holdings, increasing their value when it suited his business interests, or decreasing the value when he was seeking some kind of loan or tax break. So Donald Trump is not out of the woods, even though he was not a defendant in this case that has now resulted in the conviction of his company. And you're right, Terry, Trump, though not a defendant, came up a lot. By one estimate, the defense brought him up 60 times to say he didn't know, but prosecutors said that he, in fact, sanctioned some of the tax fraud.
All right, well, Aaron, thank you, and thank you for covering the trial for us. I know you're going to be busy with its aftermath. I want to bring in now former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti on these charges and this verdict. Thanks for being with us, Renato. If I could just ask, what's your reaction? And once again, I don't cover business criminal cases that much. Of the scale of the alleged wrongdoing and what it tells us about that company.
Well, it's significant. I mean, it certainly suggests a complete breakdown of any compliance function there. There's no culture of compliance. This is an organization that from the very top was sanctioning criminal activity. So obviously, not a very good look for that company. And also, I would just add, a problem going forward for them because there is an ongoing civil case that the Attorney General has brought seeking extraordinary remedies against the Trump organization, where, for example, the organization would potentially lose its license, no longer exist in New York State, would have all sorts of limits placed upon it. And in that same, this is the same company, of course, that now is been convicted of felony fraud charges. So I think very significant implications down the road for the Trump organization as well.
And Renato, the president's talking about the economy in Arizona, so we're going to go to that for a minute. But I want to get one more quick thought from you on what a lot of people who voted for Trump, right? There were 71 million in the last election, and Trump himself is saying that this prosecution began not with an investigation of a crime, but an investigation of a person. In other words, that this was targeted prosecution. What do you make of that? And just as a former prosecutor, what do you think about that in this case?
Well, it's a very, very bizarre argument to make because Donald Trump wasn't charged. I mean, the Manhattan DA could have charged Donald Trump, did not do so, showed some restraint, which I think is admirable. And here you have a company where the CFO of that company pleaded guilty to fraud and testified under oath that the company was committing fraud. How could you be surprised that a jury came to this conclusion? And certainly, how could you criticize the verdict? Here, it's very difficult for me to understand how you would expect a jury to come to any other conclusion given the testimony of its CFO.
Right. And the jury once again held to the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal trial, and that's what they found. Renato Mariotti, and as well as Aaron Katersky, John Santucci, Brad Garrett, thanks to all on this case.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.